Chapter 6 1. Before Australia's 6 colonies federated in 1901, they were, to an almost ludicrous degree, separate. Each issued its own postage stamps, set clocks to its own time, had its own system of taxes and levies. As Geoffrey Blainey notes in A Shorter History of Australia, a pub owner in Wodonga in Victoria who wished to sell beer brewed in Albury on the opposite bank of the Murray River in New South Wales paid as much duty as he did on beer shipped from Europe. Clearly this was madness, so in 1891 the 6 colonies, plus New Zealand, which nearly joined but later dropped out, met in Sydney to discuss forming a proper nation to be known as Commonwealth of Australia. It took some years to iron everything out, but on January 1st, 1901, a new nation was declared. Because Sydney and Melbourne were so closely matched in terms of preeminence, it was agreed in a spirit of compromise to build a new capital somewhere in the bush. Melbourne, meanwhile, would serve as interim capital. Years were consumed with squabbles about where the capital should be sited before the selectors eventually settled on an obscure farming community on the edge of the Tidbinbilla Hills in southern New South Wales. It was called Canberra, though the name by then was often anglicized to Canberry. Cold in the winter, blazing hot in the summer, miles from anywhere, it was an unlikely choice of location for a national capital. About 900 square miles of surrounding territory, most of it pastoral and pretty nearly useless, was ceded by New South Wales to form the Australian Capital Territory, a federal zone on the model of America's own District of Columbia. So the young nation had a capital. The next challenge was what to call it, and yet more periods of passion and rancor were consumed with settling the matter. King O'Malley, the American-born politician who was a driving force behind federation, wanted to call the new capital Shakespeare. Other suggested names were Mueller, Wheat Wool Gold, Wheat Wool Gold, Emu, Eucalypta, Sidmelad Parbrisho, the first syllables of the state capitals. Opossum, Gladstone, Thirstyville, Kookaburra, Cromwell, and the ringingly inane Victoria Fedendera Defender. In the end, Canberra won more or less by default. At an official ceremony to mark the decision, the wife of the Governor-General stood up before the gathering of dignitaries and, in a querulous voice, announced that the winning name was the one that had been in use all along. Unfortunately, no one had thought to brief her, and she mispronounced it, placing the accent emphatically on the middle syllable, making it Canberra rather than lightly on the first, as in Canberra or even Canberra. Never mind. The young nation had a site for a capital and a name for a capital, and it had taken them just 11 years since Union to get there. At this blistering pace, all being well, they might get a city going with half a century or so. In fact, it would take rather longer. Although Canberra is now the sixth largest metropolis in the nation and one of the most important planned communities on earth, it remains Australia's greatest obscurity. As national capitals go, it is still not an easy place to get to. It lies 40 miles off the main road from Sydney to Melbourne, the Hume Highway, and is similarly spanned by the principal railway lines. Its main road to the south doesn't go anywhere much, and the city has no approach at all from the west other than on a dirt track from the little town of Tumut. In 1996, the Prime Minister John Howard caused a stir after his election by declining to live in Canberra. He would, he announced, continue to reside in Sydney and commute to Canberra as duties required. As you can imagine, this caused an uproar among Canberra's citizens, presumably because they hadn't thought of that themselves. What made this particularly interesting is that John Howard is by far the dullest man in Australia. Imagine a very committed funeral home director, someone whose burning ambition from the age of 11 was to be a funeral home director, whose proudest achievement in adulthood was to be elected president of the Queanbeyan and District Funeral Home Directors Association. Then halve his personality and halve it again, and you have pretty well got John Howard. When a man as outstandingly colorless as John Howard turns his nose up at the place, you know it must be worth a look. I couldn't wait to see it. You approach Canberra along a divided highway through rural woodland, which gradually morphs into a slightly more urban boulevard, though still in woodland, until finally you arrive at a zone of well-spaced but significant-looking buildings, and you realize that you're there, or as near there as you can get in a place as scattered and vague as Canberra. It's a very strange city in that it's not really a city at all, but rather an extremely large park with a city hidden in it. It's all lawns and trees and hedges and a big ornamental lake, all very agreeable, just a little unexpected. I took a room in a Hotel Rex for no other reason than that I happened upon it and had never stayed in a hotel named for a family pet. The Hotel Rex was exactly what you would expect a large hotel built of concrete and called the Rex to be, but I didn't care. I was eager to stretch my legs and gambol about in all that green space. So I checked in, dumped my bags, and returned at once to the open air. I'd passed a visitors center on the way in and recollected it as being a short walk away, so I decided to start there. In the event, it was a long way, a very long way, as things in Canberra invariably proved to be. The visitors center was almost ready to close when I got there, and in any case was just an outlet for leaflets and brochures for tourist attractions and places to stay. In a side room was a small theater showing one of those desperately upbeat promotional films with a title like Campbella, It's Got It All. The ones that boast how you can water ski and shop for an evening gown and have a pizza all in the same day because this place has got it all. You know the kind I mean. But I watched the film happily because the room was air conditioned and it was a pleasure to sit after walking so far. It was just as well that I didn't require an evening gown or pizza or water skiing when I returned to the street because I couldn't find a thing anywhere. My one tip for you if you ever go to Campbella is don't leave your hotel without a good map, a compass, several days' provisions, and a cell phone with the number of a rescue service. I walked for 2 hours through green, pleasant, endlessly identical neighborhoods, never entirely confident that I wasn't just going around in a large circle. From time to time, I would come to a leafy rotary with spoked rows radiating off in various directions, each presenting an identical vista of Antipodean suburban heaven, and I would venture down the one that looked most likely to take me to civilization, only to emerge 10 minutes later at another identical rotary. I never saw another soul on foot or anyone watering a lawn or anything like that. Very occasionally, a car would glide past, pausing at each intersection, the driver looking around with a despairing expression that said, "Now where the fuck is my house?" I had it in mind that I would find a handsome pub of the type that I had so often enjoyed in Sydney, a place filled with office workers winding down at the end of a long day, so popular at this hour that there would be an overspill of happy people on the sidewalk. This would be followed by dinner in a neighborhood bistro of charm and hearty portions. But diversions of this or any other type seemed signally lacking in the sleepy streets of Campbella. Eventually and abruptly, I turned a corner and was downtown. Here at last were stores and restaurants and all the other commercial amenities of a city, but all were closed. Downtown Campbella was primarily a series of plazas wandering between retail premises and devoid of any sign of life but for a noise of slap and clatter that I recognized after a moment as the sound of skateboard. Having nothing better to do, I followed the sounds to an open square where half a dozen adolescents, all in backward-facing baseball caps and baggy shorts, were honing their modest and misguided skills on a metal railing. I sat for a minute on a bench and with morbid interest watched them risking compound fractures and severe testicular trauma for the fleeting satisfaction of sliding along a banister for a distance of from 0 inches to a couple of feet before being launched by gravity and the impossibility of maintaining balance into space in the direction of an expanse of unyielding pavement. It seemed a remarkably foolish enterprise. If there is anything more half-witted than asking 6 adolescents in backward-facing baseball caps for a dining recommendations, then it doesn't occur to me just at the moment, but I'm afraid this is what I did. Are you American? Asked one of the kids in a tone of surprise that I wouldn't necessarily have expected to encounter in a world capital. I allowed that I was. There's a McDonald's just around the corner. Gently I explained that it was not actually a condition of civil citizenship that I eat the food of my nation. I was thinking of maybe a nice Thai restaurant, I suggested. They looked at me with that flummoxed, dead-end expression that you have to be 14 years old to produce with conviction. Or perhaps an Indian? I offered hopefully and got the same no one home look. Indonesia? I went on. Vietnamese, Lebanese, Greek, Mexican, West Indian, Malaysian. As the list grew, they shifted uncomfortably as if fearing that I was going to hold them individually accountable for the inadequacies of the local culinary scene. Italian? I said. There's a Pizza Hut on Lonsdale Street. Piped out one with a look of triumph. They do an all-you-can-eat buffet on Tuesdays. Thanks, I said, realizing this was getting me nowhere, and started to leave, but then turned back. It's Friday today, I pointed out. Yeah, the kid agreed, nodding solemnly. They don't do it on Fridays. I found my way back to the Rex, but got only as far as the front entrance when I realized that I did not want to dine in my own hotel. It is such a tame and lonely thing to do, an admission that one has no life. As it happened, I had no life, but that wasn't quite the point. Do you know what is most melancholy part of dining alone in your hotel? It's when they come and take away all the other place settings and wine glasses, as if to say, obviously no one will be joining you tonight, so we'll just whip away all these things and seat you here facing the pillar, and in a minute we'll bring you a very large basket with just one roll in it. Enjoy. So I lingered by the entrance of the Rex for the merest moment, then returned to the street. I was on a boulevard built on an important scale, though it had almost no traffic, and Gesundheit was mostly lined with darkened office buildings lurking in dense growth. Several hundred yards farther on, I came to a hotel not unlike the Rex. It contained an Italian restaurant with its own entrance, which was probably as good as I was going to get. I went in and was taken aback to realize that it was full of locals dressed up as if for an occasion. Something in their familiar manner with the waiters and with the surroundings generally bespoke a more than transient relationship with the place. When locals eat in a restaurant of a big glass and concrete hotel, you know that the community must be in some measure wanting. The waiter took away all the other place settings, but he brought me 6 breadsticks, enough to share if I made a friend. It was quite a jolly place with everyone around me getting comprehensively refreshed. The Australians do like a drink, bless them, and the food was outstanding, but it was nonetheless evident that we were dining in a hotel. Canberra has quite a lot of this, as I was to discover. Eating and drinking in large characterless hotels and other neutral places, so that you spend much of the time feeling as if you're on some kind of long layover at an extremely spacious international airport. Afterwards, bloated with pasta, 3 bottles of Italian lager, and all 6 of the breadsticks, I never did make a friend. I went for another exploratory amble, this time in a slightly contrary direction, certain that somewhere in Canberra there must be a normal pub and possibly a convivial restaurant for the following evening, but I passed nothing and once again found myself eventually on the threshold of the Rex. I looked at my watch. It was only 9:30 in the evening. I wandered into the cocktail lounge, where I ordered a beer and took a seat in a deep-backed chair. The lounge was empty, but for a table with 3 men and a woman at it, getting boisterously merry, and the lone gent hunched over a tumbler at the beer. I drank my beer and pulled out a small notebook and pen and placed them on the table in front of me in case I was taken with a sudden important observation, then followed that with a book I had bought at a second-hand bookshop in Sydney, called Inside Australia and published in 1972. It was by the American journalist John Gunter, a name that once towered in the annals of travel journalism, but is now, I fear, largely forgotten. It was his last book. It just about had to be, as he died while preparing it. Poor man. I opened it to the chapter on Canberra, curious to see what he had to say about the place back then. The Canberra he describes is a small city of 130,000 people with the pastoral feeling of a country town, an easy-going place with few traffic lights, little nightlife, a modest sparkling of cocktail lounges, and about half a dozen good restaurants. In the world, it appeared actually to have gone backward since 1972. In a word, it appeared actually to have gone backward since 1972. I was proud to see that the Rex Hotel was singled out as a stylish address for visitors. Always nice to see one's choices validated even when they were nearly 30 years out of date, and that its cocktail bar was adjudged one of the liveliest in the city. I looked up from my book and shrank at the thought that very possibly it still was. At length I turned to the chapter on Australian politics, my reason for buying the book in the first place. Apart from the scorings of Australian rules football and the appeal of a much esteemed dish called the pie floater, think of something unappetizing and brown floating on top of something unappetizing and green, and you pretty well have it. There's nothing in Australian life more complicated and bewildering to the outsider than its politics. I had tried once or twice to wade through books on Australian politics written by Australians, but all these had started from the novel premise that the subject is interesting. A bold position to be sure, but not a very helpful one. So I was hoping that the detached observations of the fellow American might be more instructive. Gunther gave it a game stab, I must say, but it was a challenge beyond even his talents for lucid compression. Here, for instance, is just a snippet of his attempt to explain Australia's system of preference voting. If after the second preference votes are added to the first, there is still no candidate with a majority of the total ballots cast, the process is repeated. The ballots of the candidate trailing at this stage of the computation are divided up on the basis of second preference. If he inherited some second preference votes from the first man eliminated, these are now redistributed on the basis of third preference, and so on. I particularly liked that casual concluding, and so on. It's a deft piece of work because it seems to say, I understand all this perfectly, but I see no need to tax you with the details. Whereas, of course, what he really is saying is, I haven't the faintest idea what any of this means, and frankly, I don't give two tiny mouse droppings, because as I pen these words, I am sitting in the lounge bar of a bush mausoleum called the Rex Hotel, and it's a Friday night, and I am half cut and bored out of my mind, and now I am going to go and get another drink. The uncanny thing was I knew the feeling exactly. I glanced at my watch, appalled to realize it was only 10 minutes after 10, and ordered another beer, then picked up the notebook and pen, and after a minute's thought wrote, Canberra, awfully boring place. Beer cold though. Then I thought for a bit more and wrote, buy socks. Then I put the notebook down, but not away, and tried without much success to eavesdrop on the conversation among the lively foursome across the room. Then I decided to come up with a new slogan for Canberra. First I wrote, Canberra, there's nothing to it. And then, Canberra, why wait for death? Then I thought some more and wrote, Canberra, gateway to everywhere else, which I believed I liked best of all. Then I ordered another beer and drew a little cartoon. I showed two spawning salmon halfway up a series of lively cascades, resting exhausted in a pool of calm water, when one turns to the other and says, why don't we just stay here and masturbate? This amused me very much, and I put the page in my pocket against the day I learned to draw objects that people can actually recognize. Then I eavesdropped on the people some more, nodding and smiling appreciatively when they appeared to make a quip in the hope that they would see me and invite me over, but they didn't. Then I had another beer. I think that last beer might have been a mistake because I don't remember much after that other than a sensation of supreme goodwill toward anyone who passed through the room, including a Filipina who came in with a vacuum cleaner and asked me to lift my legs so that she could clean under my chair. My notes for the evening show only 2 other entries, both in a slightly unsteady hand. One says, Victoria bitter, why cold? Not bitter at all, but quite nice. The other said, I tell you, Barry, he was farting sparks. I believe this was in reference to a colorful Aussie turn of phrase I overheard from the people at the next table rather than to any actual manifestation of flatulence of an electrical nature. But I could be wrong. I'd had a few.